Hey guys, it's Caden. This is going to be my part 3 to my Psychology and Social Experiments iceberg, so if you haven't checked out the first videos, I will leave a link in the description to those, but other than that, thanks for watching. The FANTZ looking chamber was a study done by Robert L. FANTZ in 1961. The purpose of the study was to get a better understanding of the infant mind, and they did this by recording what they preferred to look at. He did this by creating a looking chamber, which was similar to an MRI machine, but instead had an opening at the top for images to be hung from. The images shown were either a bullseye, a drawing of a human face, or a drawing of a human face with the facial features scrambled up. As the infants were being shown these images, FANTZ would then record how long the infant would look at each image. He would then compare and analyze these times to see which image was most preferred by the infants. The results showed that the 2-month-old infants looked at the face around 2 times as long as the bullseye. The infants also preferred and gave more attention to the regular human face drawing rather than the scrambled one. FANTZ also recorded that 1-month-old infants can follow slow movements and can comprehend when objects are moving closer to them or further from them. At around 3 months old, FANTZ claims that infants have the ability to tell their family members apart from each other. Lastly, the results showed that infants can develop racial preferences at around the age of 9 months, as white infants only recognize faces of their own race. FANTZ implies that this is due to an evolutionary survival instinct, as babies are fully dependent on the adults, so they are innately programmed to recognize facial features of adult humans. The study also shows that nature plays a big part in the learning process of an infant, which I talked about earlier on this iceberg with the Bobo doll experiment. The two-factor theory of emotion was a study done by Schachter and Singer in 1962. Their hypothesis was that emotion was made up of 2 things: physical arousal and the cognitive label we give that arousal. So imagine that it's late at night and you're in a dark parking lot and you notice someone walking towards you in a hoodie. According to the two-factor theory of emotion, the physical arousal would be your heart racing or your body trembling, and the cognitive label you put on that is fear, as you know those are clear symptoms of fear. The emotion felt in this situation would not be the same emotion felt as if it was in broad daylight and the man in the hoodie was rather an old lady. To test their hypothesis, they conducted an experiment where they injected 184 males with epinephrine. Epinephrine is basically just a hormone that induces rapid breathing, body trembling, or increased heart rate. They used deception, so basically the participants simply thought that they were just taking a new drug to test their eyesight. All the groups were told that there was no side effects, except for one group that was told the actual side effects that they would be feeling of the epinephrine. The participants were then questioned by a confederate or an actor that was instructed by the researchers to either act euphoric or angry. They recorded and analyzed the attitudes and behavior of the participants while being questioned by the confederate. The results showed that the participants who were not informed about the side effects either felt more angry or more happy depending on the confederate they got when compared to the group that was informed of the side effects they would be feeling. The results showed that the participants who had no explanation for the side effects of the drug were more likely to be susceptible to the emotional influence of the confederate, which would explain why some would feel more happy or more angry depending on which one they got. This study does have some criticism, a notable one being by Marshall and Zimbardo, who recreated the study later on. Their results showed that any unexplained physical arousal induced negative emotions, no matter which type of confederate they were questioned by. The Good Samaritan experiment was a study done on prosocial behavior by John Darley and Daniel Batson in the early 1970s. They did this by studying students at the Princeton Theological Seminary, which is the school for students training to be priests. The main focus question of the study was to see if dispositional or situational factors influence the likelihood of prosocial behavior. The difference between dispositional factors and situational factors is kind of the same as comparing intrinsic value to extrinsic value. For example, did someone smile at you because they just have a happy quality about them and love smiling at others, or was it because of the situational factor of you holding the door open for them? The students were asked to meet with researchers and fill out a survey to determine if they were training to become a priest due to intrinsic reasoning or extrinsic reasoning. An intrinsic reason would be, for example, I really want to do good in the world and just help others, while an extrinsic reason would be, for example, I really just want to get into heaven. The students were then told that they would give a sermon later in the day over the Good Samaritan, which is a story from the Bible. The story goes that there is a man on the side of the road, sick and crying for help, as a bunch of holy Samaritans pass up on him, unwilling to help. The story ends with an unholy Samaritan stopping to help the man in need on the side of the road. The contents of this story will be more relevant later on in this experiment. After being told this news, they were then selected randomly into one of the 3 conditions where they were told that they were either very early and had time to loaf around, on time, which they should probably leave right about now, or were late and they should really get going. As the students made their way to meet with the other participants to give this sermon, they would all be rigged into running into a sick man on the side of the road asking for help. This sick man was obviously a Confederate and was just acting under the researchers' instructions. To make sure that everybody noticed the sick man, they placed him in an alleyway which was sectioned 4 feet wide, so if you had to ignore him, you had to step over him. The results showed that dispositional factors or intrinsic reasoning had 0 bearing or influence on helping behavior. The conditions seemed to play the biggest role in this experiment, as the people who were told that they were early helped 63% of the time, the people that were told that they were on time helped about 43% of the time, and the people that were told that they were late helped only about 10% of the time. The most surprising part of this experiment is that even with time on their hands, only about 60% of all participants helped the man in need. This is kind of ironic, as they are training to be priests and are on their way to do a sermon on the Good Samaritan story. This would then answer their main focus question, as the situational factors were the more dominant factor in the experiment. The Violinist at the Metro was an experiment done by Gene Weingarten in 2007. He wanted to test the priorities of people's attention and how observant they were of what's going on around them. He did this by inviting premier violinist and Grammy-winning musician Joshua Bell to play some of the most hardest and intricate pieces of violin music ever made on his $4 million violin in a metro system in Washington, D.C. Just 2 days before this experiment was performed, Joshua Bell had sold out a Boston theater where an average ticket costed around $100 just to hear him play his violin. During Joshua's performance at the metro station, around 1,000 people passed up on him, but only 7 stopped to listen to the performance. 20 of those 1,000 people gave up spared change to Joshua, which accumulated to around $32 at the end of the day. Some factors explained why most people didn't stop, as one of them was they were in a metro station, so most people are on their way to work. Others were that they are in Washington, D.C., so they do hear a lot of street performers, and most of the time they aren't famous violinist Joshua Bell. And others claim that people just don't like classical music, even if it is played well. In response to the results, Gene then stated, "If we don't have a moment to stop and listen to the best musician play the best music ever written, what else are we missing?" The Moving to Opportunity was a social experiment done by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development in the 1990s. The purpose of this study was to give low-income families with children a chance to move to private market housing in much less distressed communities. They did this by placing around 4,600 low-income families into 3 conditions. The first condition let the groups of families have a voucher which they could use to move to any low-poverty neighborhood they could. In the second condition, the families were offered the traditional Section 8 housing, and the third condition was just a control group. After a little more than a decade, the families were asked to return and be evaluated to see the effects of the program on them and their children. They basically wanted to see if there was any long-term effects of the program, and if there were effects, they wanted to see when they occurred and how they evolved. The data showed that the groups that were randomly assigned to the 2 MTO groups that were offered actually helped the families live in a safer environment, a lower poverty rate, and actually decreased the racial segregation in the neighborhood. The results of the analysis showed that the MTO housing project actually had many benefits for the adults and the youth as well. Some of these benefits for the adults include a healthier physical and mental state, as the rate of diabetes and obesity was lower than the control group, and the rate of depression was lower as well. There was no real health effects for the children, but there were decreases in problematic behavior and an increase in mental health for women, but not males. In one of the interim data sets, which was done about 4 years after the project, there was shown a short-term decrease in violent crime arrest in the youth. One of the major criticisms of this study to be noted is done by Arlene Geronimus and J. Philip Thompson in 2004. They basically called this study politically naive, as moving low-income families to high-income neighborhoods will solve the immediate problems such as better medical services and fresh, clean water. What they mainly didn't like is that it addressed a lot of problems that didn't really matter, but it didn't address the actual cause or the root of poverty or the toxic stress that these low-income families usually have to deal with. They also stated that racial segregation and racism also played a bigger influence in the study than was actually stated by the researcher. The Lost Letter experiment was done by Stanley Milgram in the early 1970s. His hypothesis was that people would be more likely to return a lost letter if they supported the destination. For example, a Democrat would be more likely to return a lost letter if the destination was to the Democratic candidate's headquarters rather than the Republican candidate's headquarters. He did this by dropping a handful of letters with different destinations throughout a public location. Some of these destinations were the Medical Research Center, the Friends of the Communist Party, and Friends of the Nazi Party. Other letters were just sent to random individuals as a control group. After some time, he then recorded the amount of letters that were returned based on their destination. He found that the letters that were sent to the Medical Research Center and to random individuals had a return rate of about 72%, while the Friends of the Nazi Party and Communist Party only had a return rate of about 25%. Milgram repeated the study and found that he could predict the presidential election based off of this method. He dropped letters around public locations for and against Lyndon B. Johnson and for and against Barry Goldwater and found that the majority of the population returned the Lyndon B. Johnson letters. This obviously showed to be true as Lyndon B. Johnson came to be the next president of the United States. This study was significant because it allowed researchers to record the attitudes and factors that influence helping behavior without having to directly ask them. Using this method, researchers can record data with little to no biases at all. The Invisible Gorilla Experiment is a selective attention test done by Christopher Chabris and Daniel Simmons in 2010. I'm not going to say much about this because I actually do have the book and I have read it and it's actually really interesting, so I might do a book review video in the future, so be looking out for that. If you want to check out the original experiment yourself, I'll leave a link in the description below. Place is a social experiment done by Josh Wardle in 2017 on Reddit. If Wardle sounds familiar, it's because he is the software engineer that developed the popular game Wordle. It was a subreddit with an online canvas that users could edit by changing one pixel into one of 16 colors. Once the user edited the pixel, there would then be a 5 to 20 minute timer until they could place another pixel. After about 72 hours, Reddit administrators took down the social experiment. During those 3 days, there was over 1 million users who edited over 16 million pixels. At about the time that the subreddit had ended, there was nearly 90,000 active users on the subreddit. The canvas was commended for its representation of Reddit's online community and the internet culture as a whole. So much so, they tried to repeat it in 2022. On April Fool's Day of this year, there was a subreddit with an online canvas that was enlarged and users could actively edit it. The same rules applied as the subreddit before. The online canvas was edited for about 4 days where over 72 million pixels were edited by over 6 million users. At one point, there was even a rate of 2.5 million pixels being edited per hour. This canvas included famous paintings, fictional characters, cultural flags, and some of the most popular memes of this year. The button is another social experiment done by Josh Wardle on Reddit in 2015. On April 1st of 2015, he created a subreddit with a 60-second timer that would be reset for all users each time the button was pressed. Josh made it so that accounts made before April 1st, 2015 could only press the button one time, meaning that no one can make a bunch of accounts and just keep on pressing it. From April 1st, 2015 to June 5th, 2015, the timer never hit 0. Actually, it did hit 0 a couple of times, but it was due to technical issues with the website because there was clicks being logged to the button, but the timer wasn't reset. June 5th was the actual day where the timer hit 0 and there was no logged clicks. When you clicked on the subreddit, it would then just read, "The experiment is over." At the end of these 2 months, there was 1,008,316 logged clicks. This is basically just another commendment for the online community, especially for Reddit. The facial expression experiment was done by Carney Landis in 1924. Carney was interested in the human emotion and was more specifically interested in which came first, physiological changes or the actual emotion itself. The most popular theory about this topic was by James Lange, who said that physiological changes and messages from your nervous system cause an emotion. If this theory were true, that would mean that a certain stimuli should enact an identical emotion or expression across every human being. With no real concrete evidence or base to back up this theory, many people would heckle it and criticize it by asking where's the gland of sadness or happiness or really any other emotion you can express. With the main focus question being, are these physiological changes the same for everybody, he used a method where he would record facial muscle movement when emotion arised. After recruiting graduate students to be the subjects, he would then mark their face that would highlight creases and grimaces of facial movement. The participant would then be showed a stimuli where their facial expression or emotion would be captured immediately right after through a photograph. The first wave of stimuli was pretty simple, as the participants would listen to jazz music, smell ammonia, read passages from the Bible, and tell lies. After recording the results, Carney felt that he didn't really get the emotions that he was looking for and figured he'd raise the stakes. He did this by showing them graphic adult movies, videos, and pictures of horrendous skin conditions, and even fired off a gun during the experiment to capture their reaction. After these results were analyzed, he still felt that he really didn't get what he was looking for, so he figured he'd raise the stakes even higher. In front of the participants, which were now blindfolded, was placed a box full of frogs and were given instructions to find a key. After the participants searched for a while trying to figure out what they were grabbing, they would then try to grab the key, but they would rather be shocked because there wasn't a key, there was just an open electrical wire. Pictures were taken after each stimuli to capture the expression and reaction of the participant, but unfortunately they aren't quite done with this experiment yet. The participants were given a mouse in one hand and a blade in the other and was instructed to decapitate it. Most participants seemed stunned, but Carney continued, saying that if they weren't going to do it, he was going to do it for them. As the participants took the life from this mouse, their reactions were quite varied. Some participants were shook and cried or were in complete shock and just were frozen, while others were hysterically laughing or started to swear at the researchers. 2/3 of the participants followed orders and decapitated the mouse, meaning that 1/3 watched it. If you recall, the participants are all graduate students, but there is even a younger kid who was around 13 years old who was there for medical research. This boy had psychological issues and high blood pressure, and the researchers wanted to see what the stimuli would do to that. Most of the results of this experiment were very dull and not noteworthy, but he came to 5 conclusions. The first was that there was no typical facial expression for the emotional arousal in the experiment. The second one being that facial expressions shouldn't be characterized by repetitive patterns in facial movement. The third conclusion was that smiling was the most common expression, even through some of the gory stuff that the participants went through. The fourth conclusion was that asymmetrical bodily reactions never occurred throughout the experiment, and the fifth being that men were more reactive than women. There's a lot of ethical issues throughout this experiment, but basically it was all for nothing because the results weren't noteworthy and there was no justification for the execution of the mouse. Even with all these ethical issues throughout the experiment, you still have to point out that 2/3 of the participants executed the mouse. That stat kind of ties this experiment into the Milgram experiment, which I talked about earlier on this ICEBERG tier list, which if you haven't checked out, I'll leave a link in the description to the earlier videos below. To summarize the relation between these two experiments, basically this experiment is where the participants are cutting off heads of mouses when they didn't want to, and the Milgram experiment is where people are shocking other people when they didn't want to. The monkey drug trials of 1969 were experiments done to research the effects of drugs and the addiction that comes with it. They wanted to administer drugs to monkeys and rats to see if they would become dependent on them and eventually self-medicate. The experiment began when researchers captured the monkeys, caged them, and began to fill them with drugs. These drugs included cocaine, morphine, alcohol, and amphetamines. After being injected with it, the researchers would then record the behavior of the monkeys. In some trials, the monkeys were injected with one drug, while in other trials, the monkeys were injected with combinations of drugs. The researchers then taught these monkeys how to self-medicate and use these drugs while being fully independent. After doing that, the researchers would then cage them with a supply of drugs inside the cage. The results showed that the monkeys quickly became fully dependent on the drugs and became chaotic, erratic, and a danger to the other monkeys and even themselves. The trials were over as the monkeys eventually all passed away. The significant part of the results came from being able to observe the behavior of the monkeys during this drug abuse. Due to there being so many similar biological traits between humans and monkeys, the researchers were then able to claim that one of the biggest reasons for drug abuse is psychological dependence. This is one of the more unethical experiments on this tier list, especially because of the animal abuse. It was basically deemed unethical because it caused stress and eventually death to all these monkeys. This study also lacked ecological validity, as animals don't have the ability to administer drugs to themselves other than being taught by humans. Other than being able to observe these behavioral traits between monkeys and humans, there's no real justification for the stress and death brought upon these monkeys. The Little Albert experiment was done by John B. Watson in 1920. The research consisted of classical conditioning on humans. Watson wanted to condition a phobia onto an emotionally stable infant. The researchers chose a 9-month-old infant from a hospital who was just known as Albert. They would then expose the infant to a white rabbit, a white rat, a dog, a mask with and without hair, cotton, wool, burning newspaper, and other stimuli. During the first exposure to the stimuli, Albert showed little to no fear to any of them. 2 months later, Albert would then be brought back and put on a mattress on a table in the middle of a room. The researchers then brought in a white rat and placed it on the mattress with Albert. The researchers would stand behind Albert with a steel bar and a hammer and would strike them together each time that Albert reached out to the white rat. Each strike of the hammer made a loud ringing noise, which caused Albert to begin crying and showing fear of the loud noise. After doing that for some time, Albert was then left alone with only the rat. He immediately seemed distressed and began crying and even crawling away from the rat. Watson's intentions were successful as the emotions brought on by the loud noise were conditioned to the rat. They even doubled up by showing Albert the stimuli from before, which he was discomforted by mostly all of them. Albert seemed to be distressed at the sight of a bunny, a dog, a white winter coat, and even a Santa mask with cotton balls as a beard. At the end of the experiment, Watson failed to desensitize Albert, so he just figured that Albert grew up to be scared of furry white things for the rest of his life. The funny thing is that no one really knows what happened to Albert, as that was just a code name and his real identity was never identified. Jesus, that scared the fuck out of me. There's a bunch of conspiracy theories about what actually happened to Albert, where some say that he just lived on to be a healthy dude, and others say that he died tragically like 5 years later, but no one really knows, so I'm just gonna leave y'all to that. This experiment was obviously deemed unethical due to the stress put onto Albert, as he literally put a phobia into him. It was also lacking validity, as it was only a single case study and there was no control group. A graduate student of John B. Watson, Mary Cover Jones, did her own experiment when she was interested in the same topic. Instead of inserting a phobia, her goal was to try to fix or cure a phobia of a kid named Peter. Peter was extremely fearful of white fluffy animals, and Mary tried to cure it by using direct conditioning. This included direct contact from white fluffy animals and contact with other kids who weren't afraid of white fluffy animals. The experiment was a huge success, and Peter left the study with no fear of white fluffy animals. With this study also being very famous, Mary was then named the mother of behavioral therapy. A Class Divided was a social experiment done by Jane Elliott in 1968. She did this experiment the day after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, as the children were confused as why the hero of the month was murdered. Jane then tried to explain discrimination, racism, and prejudice to these third graders, but felt that they didn't really understand. She thought up the idea of a blue eyes, brown eyes experiment. On the first day of this exercise, blue-eyed kids were given privileges over brown-eyed kids. These privileges included extra recess time, early lunch line access, and other benefits that weren't offered to the brown-eyed kids. The brown-eyed kids would have to wear a collar all day and were constantly told that they were inferior to the blue-eyed kids. On the next day, the roles were reversed, where brown-eyed kids were privileged and the blue-eyed kids were ridiculed. Elliott claimed that she saw cooperative, marvelous, thoughtful children turn into vicious, discriminating third graders in the matter of 15 minutes. On both days, the group that was informed that they were inferior did worse on tests and other work when compared to the group that was told that they were superior. William Peters, the director of the PBS series Frontline, became interested and wanted to recreate the study in 1970 and film it. Jane agreed, and they filmed an episode of Frontline, which later was premiered as The Eye of the Storm. During the exercise, William stated that he was amazed of how involved the kids were in the activity and how they didn't even seem to think that they were being recorded. 14 years later, these third graders, now being in high school, were reunited with the experimenters and shown the Frontline episode, The Eye of the Storm. Even though being glad to be in the experiment, the kids watched and discussed an embarrassment of their attitudes and behaviors during the exercise. Some of the brown-eyed students claimed to recall how angry they were when they had to put on the collar and the immediate empowerment when the collar was removed. Jane Ellie even tried to recreate the blue eyes, brown eyes exercise with adults in a corrections department. Her results showed that the behavior of the adults were very similar to the behavior of the third graders during the exercise. The cognitive dissonance experiments were done by Festinger and Carl Smith in 1959. Cognitive dissonance is basically where a human is caught in a situation involving conflict of one of their internal beliefs or opinions. In theory, the only way to stop this dissonance is to change your attitude about the conflicting opinions. For example, if you were smoking cigarettes and knew that cigarettes were unhealthy for you, you were now caught in cognitive dissonance. To stop this dissonance, the person would then have two options: change the action and quit smoking, or change the belief that smoking is unhealthy and continue smoking. There are three causes to cognitive dissonance: forced compliance behavior, decision-making, and effort. Festinger and Carl Smith would then develop an experiment where they would take 71 male students and ask them to do a boring, dull task such as turning pegs on a pegboard. The students would perform this boring task for about an hour. After completing the task, the researcher would then inform the participant that the person that usually tells the next participant what to do is out, and they would like them to do it for them. He basically instructed the participants to inform the next participant that the task that they did was fun and enjoyable. This next participant is just an actor or confederate and is just working under the researchers. After given all the instructions, the researcher would then offer the participant either $1 for their work or $20 for their work. They all agreed and continued to lie to the next participant about how fun the activity was. After analyzing the results, they found that the participants who were offered $1 told the next participant that it was more fun and enjoyable than the people who were paid $20. The researchers claimed that the $1 reward was not a sufficient incentive for lying, causing the participants to have more dissonance. To balance out this dissonance, the participants' only option was to truly convince themselves that the activity was fun and enjoyable. The participants who were given $20 found that reward to be a sufficient incentive for lying, causing them to have little to no dissonance with the options. An American psychologist, Martin Seligman, did an experiment over learned helplessness in 1967. There were three groups of dogs that were harnessed and included in this experiment. The first group of dogs were essentially just harnessed for a period of time and then released. Group 2 and 3 were yoked pairs, and the dogs had to work together to solve an objective. The groups of dogs were then separated and given shocks every few seconds. The second group of dogs was introduced to a lever that they could push that would stop the shocks delivered to both Group 2 and 3. The dogs of Group 3 were never presented this lever and were fully dependent on Group 2 dogs to stop the shock. For the dogs in Group 3, the shock felt inescapable as nothing they did would stop it. The dogs were removed and the second phase of the experiment would now begin. The dogs would then be placed into a box divided by a barrier in the middle, which is only 3 to 4 inches high. The shocks would be delivered on one or the other side, making it to where the dogs could jump over the barrier to escape the shock. The dogs in Group 1 and Group 2 learned how to avoid the shock very quickly and began jumping over the barrier every few seconds to avoid the shock. The dogs in Group 3, who earlier felt that the shock was inescapable, simply just lied down and whimpered every time they were shocked and had no courage to jump over the barrier. Martin replicated this study later on as he felt that there may be a confound of a learned behavior for the dogs in Group 3 where they felt that there was no escape to the shocks. The results of this study were almost identical to the study before, as the dogs in Group 3 expressed helplessness almost exactly the same way by just laying down and taking it. He then replicated the study again as he tried to cure the learned helplessness by physically showing the dogs in Group 3 how to avoid the shock. This included moving them physically by picking them up and putting them to the other side of the box with no shock, and showing them with their paws how to jump and run over the barrier. After doing this a couple times, the dogs in Group 3 were now willingly jumping over the barrier to avoid the shock. In this replication, it seemed that physical contact was most important, as threats, rewards, and observed demonstration had no effect on the dogs in Group 3. So the final tier of this iceberg only has 4 topics, but I'm only going to talk about 3 of them because one of them is kind of like projects or like outlines of an experiment that's going to happen within the next decade, but there's no results to discuss, so I'm just going to skip over that one. The monster study was an experiment done by Mary Tudor under the supervision of Wendell Johnson in 1939. Tudor's main focus question was to see if labeling somebody as a normal speaker or a stutterer have an effect on their speech skills afterward. She began this experiment by selecting 22 children from an orphanage in Iowa. The orphans had no idea of the real intent of this research study, but they simply thought that they were just going to speech therapy. Tudor wanted to see if she could induce a stutter onto a fluent speaking child, and she also wanted to see if telling a stutterer that they were speaking normally could improve their speech skills somehow. 10 of the 22 children were actually stutterers that were selected by the teachers of the orphanage to be in the study. Tudor and 5 other graduate students would then judge the kids on their speaking ability on a scale from 1 to 5, 1 being very poor and 5 being the best. 5 kids were selected to go into Group 1A and was told that they were normal speakers, and 5 kids were selected to go into Group 1B, which were told that they were stutterers. The remaining 12 students were fluent speakers, and they were randomly selected into 2 groups. The kids in Group 2A, no matter how well they spoke, were told that they were developing a stutter or already had a stutter. Vice versa, the kids in Group 2B were told that they were speaking normally and were praised for how they spoke. On the first visit with Tudor, she would test the participants of their IQ and their handedness. There's a theory out there that says that handedness has a big role in speech quality. It basically states that people sometimes don't use the correct dominant hand, and it causes erratic neurons to fire in your brain, which causes a speech impediment. Johnson didn't believe in the theory in the first place, but he still wanted Tudor to do it. Tudor found that most of the kids were right-handed, but left-handed kids were present in each of the groups. At the end of the study, the results showed that there was no correlation between handedness and speech. Every few weeks, Tudor would drive from Davenport to Iowa to speak with the kids for 45 minutes. Tudor had an agreed-upon script with Johnson on what they would tell the kids and basically outlined what they would tell each group. The kids in Group 2B were told that if they did have a stutter, they would simply outgrow it and they were talking normally at a perfect rate. In contrast, the kids in Group 2A, no matter how well they spoke, were told that they had a bad stutter and they've never seen anything like this before, and they should do anything and everything in their power to stop it. The children in Group 2A responded almost immediately with fully negative effects. Tudor claimed that 5-year-old Norma was very difficult to talk to, even though a month ago she was a bubbly, bright student. 9-year-old Betty refused to talk and spent most of the 45 minutes with her hands over her eyes. One of the oldest subjects, 15-year-old Hazel, seemed to be more conscious of herself and spoke less. She even developed a tic where she would snap her fingers each time she messed up while speaking. The grades of the children who were involved in this experiment declined rapidly, where one boy was even thrown out of class for refusing to talk. One subject, 12-year-old Mary, even seemed to stop talking to her friends and eventually ran away from the orphanage. After the official ending of the experiment, Tudor revisited the orphanage 3 times where she told the real intentions of the research study. Although it was quite uncomfortable and tense, Tudor would then tell the children the real intentions and that they were being lied to this whole time and had no problem speaking. Afterward, Tudor claimed that the kids will recover in time, but she definitely made a deep impression on them. In 2007, 7 of the children in the experiment were awarded a total of $1.2 million from the state of Iowa for emotional scarring and torment. Before her death, Mary Tudor expressed deep regret for the children and the involvement in the experiment and scolded Johnson's little to no effort to reverse the effects. Most of Wendell Johnson's experiments and findings were hidden away due to his reputation. At the time, a huge wave of Nazi Germany's human trials and science experiments were coming out, and Wendell Johnson was scared that he would be skewed into that same group. Due to the use of human trials, this is why this study is dubbed the Monster Study. Due to Johnson's awareness of this, Mary Tudor's is some of the only information we can get off of this experiment. The surrogate mother experiment was done by Harry Harlow in 1958. The main theory at the time stated that babies innately attach their mothers for the food. Harlow disagreed and felt that love, companionship, and comfort were more important when it comes to the infant's attachment. Infant monkeys were taken from their biological mothers and raised in a lab setting with other separated caged monkeys. In social isolation, the monkeys displayed disturbing behavior such as staring blankly, circling their cages, and even engaging in self-mutilation. When the isolated monkeys were reintroduced to the group of monkeys, most of them stayed away from each other, and some even died of starvation after they refused to eat. Even without social isolation, Harlow observed that the monkeys that were raised without mothers seemed to cling onto their cloth diapers. Harlow explains that the reasoning for this is that the soft cloth diapers kind of resembled a comforting surrogate mother. This then sparked the idea for the famous surrogate mother experiment. Harlow took infant monkeys away from their biological mother and reassigned them to two inanimate surrogate mothers. One was made out of wood and wire, while the other was made out of a soft foam rubber and cloth. There was also two conditions in this experiment, one being where the wire mother would have the food, and the other being the cloth mother having the food. The results showed that no matter which condition the monkeys were placed in, they spent more time with the cloth surrogate mother. During the time that the wire mother had the food, the monkeys would simply go over there and eat, and quickly come back and cling to the cloth mother. Other tests show that the infant monkeys also use a surrogate mother for comfort when facing new situations or scary things. For example, when the infant monkeys were presented with a new, bigger cage with a surrogate mother, they would go out and explore for a little bit, then be startled and come back to the mother, and then go out and explore more. When researchers did this with no surrogate mother, the monkey would just simply curl up in a ball in the corner and not move or explore the bigger cage at all. The same thing happened when the infant monkeys were presented with a noise-making toy, where if they were with a surrogate mother, they would attack the toy, versus where they were alone, where they would do nothing and run away. This study had groundbreaking empirical evidence of the importance of maternal touch in infant development. Even with this finding, many people still think this study is to be unethical, as it did strip away infant monkeys from their biological mothers. This setback in infant development would then cause the monkeys in this experiment to not be able to live in a wildlife environment. Rhythm Zero is a social experiment done by Marina Abramovich in 1974. Marina was a performance artist who used her body as a medium. Between the years of 1973 and 1974, she did a series of performances called Rhythms. For example, in 1974, she performed Rhythm 5, which was a performance where she stood inside a wooden star that was lit on fire. She stood in the wooden star for so long that she became unconscious due to lack of oxygen. In 1973, she performed Rhythm 10, which was a performance of her cutting the webbings of her fingers over 20 times. She then used the audio recording of this performance to make a ritualistic performance later on. But I'm going to be focusing on 1974's performance of Rhythm Zero. This performance was much like Yoko Ono's Cut Piece, which I mentioned earlier in this iceberg, but on steroids. At the beginning of this performance, she stood still next to a table with 72 objects on it. Next to it read a sign which instructed the audience that they could use any one of these objects to interact with her in any way. The audience was also instructed that Marina would be taking full responsibility during this performance so that nothing would happen to the audience regardless of the actions they took. On the table, there was a gun with a single bullet, a scalpel, nails, scissors, knives, makeup, a camera, a rose, a feather, perfume, various foods, water, wine, and many other things. The performance started mild and slowly as people simply just turned her around at times and put her arms up above her head. As time went on, the audience became more creative and aggressive. Within the first 2 hours, she was touched multiple times somewhat intimately. By hour 3, all of her clothes were shredded from the scissors and the blades that the audience used on Marina. By hour 4, those same blades explored her skin, where someone slit a part of her throat where they could drink her blood. By this time, various sexual assaults on Marina by the audience occurred, but she stayed calm and emotionless. After the fact, Marina claimed that she would have stayed calm even with full-blown sexual intercourse or even murder. At this point in the performance, many of the audience members felt discomforted and formed a type of protected group for Marina. At one point, someone even loaded the gun with the bullet and put it in Marina's hand and pointed it at her head. When Marina's finger was put onto the trigger, many of the audience members were outraged and began fighting other audience members that were putting her in this position. One audience member even rushed onto the performance area and got the gun and threw it to the ground. After 6 hours of performing with her clothes shredded and her body decimated, she simply just walked away emotionless. She was praised for her mental and physical strength during the painful performance, but that wasn't the focal point of the social experiment. Due to the lack of responsibility, the audience turned vicious and had a disregard for human life in just the span of 6 hours. So this is the end of this iceberg, so if you're watching this, I appreciate it. Comment below what you thought about this series and if you enjoyed it or what else to do. But if not, then I'll figure it out. I think that's it, so thank you for watching. I really appreciate you. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see y'all later.